Okay, for AP class, I'm going to be gone today, so I made one short little video, and this is it. And you watch this, it'll take 15, 16 minutes, and then we'll be done with this packet. We'll be up until the Civil War, and you can work on your outlines, or I guess your outlines or anything else that's coming up. You can work on that. So you have plenty of time, no excuses, and then on Tuesday we come back, we'll start the Civil War, and you can ask me any questions that you have. So please write down all the questions that you have based on what I'm doing today. I just didn't want to slow down, okay? So we left off talking about the Freeport Doctrine with the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Make sure we know that. Lincoln setting up Douglas to essentially win the Senate race, but end up losing the presidential race 2 years later, and it sets up Lincoln becoming sort of nationally famous from that point on. Remember the Freeport Doctrine? He asked Lincoln whether or not, Lincoln asked Douglas whether or not a territory, Reed, stop it, whether a territory could, considering the Dred Scott decision, whether a territory could allow for slavery, and Douglas's answer wasn't particularly good. He said that a territory could choose to pass laws that disallowed, or couldn't pass laws that disallowed slavery, but didn't have to follow laws. And either way, he was going to make the North or South mad, and that kind of is what Lincoln wanted to do. And I think we also talked about John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. In 1859, in fact, in the fall of 1859, John Brown, who we already know before because of the massacre at Pottawatomie in Kansas, where he literally hacked to death people in bleeding Kansas, because he saw himself as a messenger of God. He was touched, as they say. And it was an absurdly fierce radical abolitionist. And in Harper's Ferry in Virginia, Harper's Ferry was actually an armory, and he was wanting to arm slaves and start a resistance through the South. He was caught by Captain Robert E. Lee before he became a general, was turned over and was given a trial and was executed. And this is sort of a symbolic split between the North and South, because the North, many of the North, not all, many of the North, fierce abolitionists saw him as a martyr, saw him as somebody who was doing God's work, and the South saw him as a brutal murderer. And he's sort of symbolic as a way of how the South and North are no longer able to really compromise or see eye to eye, because somebody like John Brown was so divisive. And this moves us into the election of 1856. The current president at this time was James Buchanan. He was a Northerner but with Southern sympathies. His cabinet had some Southerners in it. And so we moved to the election of 1860, and we're kind of on a precipice of what could possibly happen moving in the future. Also, I like to use the word precipice. Alright, so are there any questions? Are there any questions yet? Does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask? Student? Just come over here, student. Over here.
Who was in the election?
That's a really good question, student. You can go back to your seat. Thank you. Who was in the election? There were 4 people in the election, and I kind of have it here. The Democrats are going to end up splitting. First, the Democrats met in South Carolina, and it looked like Stephen Douglas was going to be their candidate, but he's Northern. When we talk about those Southern fire eaters who are really, really, really pro-secession, exceedingly pro-slavery, they couldn't handle a Northern representative, and the Democratic Party split. And Douglas will represent Northern Democrats, and a guy from Kentucky named John Breckinridge, who was a trans, by the way, and who was a vice president, becomes the Southern Democrat nominee, and the nominee of sort of the secessionists, right? So we have Northern Democrats are going to be pro-Douglas, Southern Democrats pro-Breckinridge. Another party, you can see the Constitutional Union Party, you can see it on your packet also. The Constitutional Union Party was sort of a party of Southern compromisers. This was a guy named John Bell. He's from Tennessee. he wanted to preserve, the Constitutional Union Party wanted to preserve the Union, but also wanted to keep the rights for slaveholders. And they were fearful, as it turns out they were correct, they were fearful that Lincoln and the Republican Party winning would cause secession. All right, so you have the Northern Democrat is Douglas, Southern Democrat Breckinridge, and then the Constitutional Union Party. And then Lincoln is obviously the interesting one. He ends up getting the nomination of the Republican Party. The Republican nominating party convention was in Chicago. And I don't know if it was destiny or it was just serendipitous. Read, get away. But the four candidates who were actually trying to be nominated, William Seward was the obvious choice. In fact, he was everyone's choice to be the Republican nominee. From New York, we talked about him before, sort of higher law Seward, who later became a good friend of Lincoln. Salmon Chase from Ohio was also better known than Lincoln. And Lincoln in these nominating conventions, delegates from all the states will come and they will have rounds of votes. And whoever so there were 4 people originally, and whoever made it to the next round, there'd be 3. And they would keep whittling down these rounds of voting, the delegates were, until they got down to 2 and then finally down to 1 nominee, and that would be the nominee for the Republican Party. And a lot of Lincoln's friends from Springfield sort of descended upon Chicago, and he didn't win, rarely ever won, the nominating vote. All he was doing, his people were doing, were trying not to lose. So in the first round, he was able to convince delegates that were against Seward, like Chase's people, don't vote for Seward, turn your votes, and let's put some with Lincoln, let's try to get rid of Seward. Well, the 4th place guy goes out, then it's Seward and Chase and Lincoln. Well, now they're going to Seward's people and say, let's go ahead and get out of Chase. Let's get Chase out of the way, Seward's people. That way, it'll be, Seward and Lincoln, and you'll clearly probably win. We want to get Chase out of the way. So then some of Seward's people, some of their, the delegates from each state at the convention would vote for Lincoln. And then Chase was gone. And it goes down to Seward and Seward and Lincoln. And then Lincoln was able to convince a bunch of Chase's delegates, and the delegate guy from Missouri, they were able to take Lincoln's people, his people, Chase's people, and get enough votes to actually have more delegates voting for him than Seward, and somehow Lincoln comes out of Chicago as a Republican nominee. And the Republicans' platform was particularly important because it's going to essentially start a trend, and the Republicans are going to literally, from 1860 until 1932, there'll only be 2 Democrats voted in. Grover Cleveland will end up having 2 terms, and obviously Woodrow Wilson will have 2 terms. So the Republican platform is going to be important moving on into the later part of the 19th century. And it involves a couple things. And it's pretty broadly based. Bringing in as many voters as it can. It's bringing in business leaders because they are pro-tariff, right? A lot of these people are a lot of Whigs obviously end up becoming Republicans. And then some sort of moderate Northern Democrats. So they are protective tariffs for business people. Non-extension of slavery. They're not wanting to extend slavery, so they get the abolition people. They also were not against immigrants. So this kind of made the Know-Nothing Party mad, but it also brought in some budding immigrants, and particularly it brought in Germans who were becoming citizens and were now voting and interactive. They also called for Pacific Railway, which later will be put into the Transcontinental Railway. Right? He also called for extension of free land for people, which is going to be called the Homestead Act. He also called for internal improvements, federally paid internal improvements, right? Whig ideas trying to bring more transportation infrastructure, and we'd already talked about transportation so much already, and really build on top of that. So this is what the Republicans are calling for. The South is saying, if you elect Lincoln, then we're leaving. And that's the last straw, because his election is symbolic of all the fears. Well, Lincoln ends up winning. And And I come back on Tuesday, I'll show you some slides and some pictures of exactly what states voted for whom and some different things on a PowerPoint, some primary evidence. But essentially, Lincoln won almost the entire North. Douglas won 2 states. He won Missouri and he won New Jersey. And Lincoln won the rest of the northern states. Douglas wins 2 northern states, Lincoln wins the rest. Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot in the South. I think in Kentucky he might have on the ballot, but the Deep South, he was not on the ballot. Buchanan gets almost the entire Deep South, right, the Southern Democrat. And then the Constitutional Union Party, the John Bell, he ends up winning Kentucky, Tennessee, and he got Virginia, right, so sort of the upper middle South. He got some of those states. But in the end, Lincoln won. He only had 40% of the popular vote. But because the northern states were so much more popular in terms of population, then he ends up winning. And as a reaction to Lincoln's victory, the southern states secede from the Union. Not all southern states, but we're going to start seeing southern states secede from the Union. And the first one, obviously, is South Carolina. A few days after Lincoln won, South Carolina state legislature, or their General Assembly for us, unanimously voted to secede from the Union. They called Lincoln a black Republican. And so in December, they have their official vote, and unanimously South Carolina leaves the Union. December of 1860, South Carolina leaves the Union. Within just a few more weeks, and this is before Lincoln ever takes office. So Lincoln had been elected, but Lincoln didn't take office until there were already 7 southern states that had left. Within 6 weeks, the entire Deep South also sees some union. So South Carolina left, then followed by Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. So the Deep South has left. Those are seven states. And they named themselves the Confederate States of America. They had a constitution. In fact, they said the Constitution gave them the right to do this. They saw themselves as akin to revolutionary heroes because much like the United States of America left England, they left a union which they thought was overbearing. As it turns out, I'm going to end up having two videos probably. Jefferson Davis, also from Kentucky, and went to Trancey for a year before he transferred to an easier school called West Point. Originally had the Southern capital in Montgomery. He was a senator from Mississippi. He had moved to the South, Deep South. But then eventually they moved their capital to Richmond, Virginia. Buchanan did really little to actually to do much about this. In fact, I mean, he was a Southern sympathizer on some level, and he didn't think that the Constitution gave him any authority to do much about this. He also knew that much of the actual army, the Northern Army, which was weak, was not huge, was scattered about the territories, much of it dealing with Native American issues, and so putting up a fight against them, they might have lost the South forever. So there might have been some sort of serendipity, or maybe it was luck, or maybe it was strategy, but in the end, Buchanan not doing much actually probably allowed the Union in the long run to stay together, because had he done something, the South probably would have left and might have stayed gone. Many Northerners at this point, who were abolitionists, still wanted to keep the Union together, but they weren't all that mad about it. It's not going to be until Fort Sumter as an issue. But are there any questions yet? Are there any other questions? Does anyone have any questions? Student?
Why did South have to leave?
That's a really good question, student. All right. Student, you are asking so many good questions. Thank you so much. So in the end, why did the South leave? I guess we'll try to get this on one big giant video. Well, number one, they were really scared at what they're seeing on the horizon. They just lost an election where the guy they didn't want wasn't even on the ballot. So, if the entire South hates a guy, but the North likes him, the North is winning. And the South did not like this as a prospect moving forward. So, as the North is getting more people, more industry, more political power, more population, more railroads, it seems like the tipping point is coming and the South is getting get out. They also didn't like the North interfering with what they thought were compromises. That is to say, you'll remember the North passing like personal liberty laws and refusing to abide by the fugitive slave law. They didn't like that. They didn't like the abolition criticism. They didn't like the Underground Railroad. And a whole bunch of them thought that the North wouldn't do anything. I mean, this is a big point. Many Southerners thought they would secede from the Union and that was it. The North wouldn't do much about it. Northern industrialists obviously got a lot of their cotton from the South, and the South thought, you know, the North needs us. We pay the North a lot of money for their goods, and I don't think they're going to go and I don't think they're going to do much about this. We can just leave. They also like the idea of getting rid of dependence on the North, starting their own country. And lastly, and I guess in hindsight this seems ironic, but they were sure that they had the moral upper hand. The South felt that they had the moral argument. They were the ones being oppressed according to their logic. Their redneck, white trash logic. They thought that they were akin to revolutionary Americans. That the original 13 states had entered the Union willingly. That the states were made up of the country itself. The country was made up of states, and the states could choose to leave if they so wanted to. And they thought they were just exercising that power, like the compact theory, as they call it, that the country was made up of compact states. And for these reasons, the South felt, specifically the Deep South, felt comfortable leaving the Union. Finally, there's one more attempt to save all of this. John Crittenden from Kentucky, who was a senator, took over after Clay died, tries an amendment, a compromise, a Crittenden compromise, the Crittenden amendment. And what he's trying to do is appease the South a little bit so this doesn't happen. And essentially what he's saying is, let's go ahead and say everything north of the 3630 line will always be free. But the South gets a guarantee that slavery would last forever and new lands would be based on popular sovereignty, including Cuba. Because John Breckinridge in the 1860 election and then Crittenden, a lot of them assumed this Cuba thing might happen, where they would break them up into states and add those states. And all other states coming into the Union in this direction would be popular sovereignty based. Lincoln rejected this, and we move into Lincoln's presidency, and when I get back we'll talk about Fort Sumter and a bunch of Lincoln's problems, and look at some primary evidence and stuff. But we are done with this packet. Please write down any questions that you have, and when I get back we can go over those. So for the rest of the period, work on your outlines, work on something. Do not be lazy, make sure you get stuff done. Student, you want to come here and say goodbye to all the people at home?
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.